Dear friends at the Unitarian Church in Glasgow, I bring greetings from your sibling congregation in Bangor, Maine, in the United States. When I first learned that I was going to be on sabbatical this year, and planning my trip to Scotland, I thought it would be wonderful to try and visit some Unitarians in the land of my ancestors on my mother's side of the family. And through our negotiations, we thought things were going pretty well until there was a realization that because of some COVID policies and whatnot, that your this Sunday, you meet a little bit later in the day. And ironically, my travels so far here have managed to pick up COVID, as you can probably hear a little bit in my voice. So I am recording my sermon and storytelling for you today from a Airbnb in Edinburgh. And have no fear, I am well taken care of by my host, and I have a friend back home who is a physician who is keeping very good track of me. But if you notice I'm looking a little weary, it's not because this is a chore, because it's something I love to do, but just more that I'm a little bit under the weather and have a little bit of my energy zapped. But it is a joy to be with you today. I hope that circumstances change, that at some point we're able to meet face. It would be great to get to know some of you, even though you have an interesting way of talking. And I do hope that somehow my being here and being present allows us to be aware that our Unitarian movement is something that is large, it is worldwide, and that we all belong to each other. Enjoy.
We light this chalice in honour of first steps, for beginning even when the path ahead is unclear, for the courage it takes to trust that the way will reveal itself, that light will come to clarify our vision, and that friends will be by our side through the journey.
Once upon a time, in a land not so far away, there was a city that had fallen on hard times. The city once was very prosperous and a very friendly place for people to live. People from all over the land came to be in that city. But something happened. Nobody knew exactly what it was. But all of a sudden, people started slowly getting angry with each other, not listening to each other, treating people badly and not accepting people for who they were or what their life circumstances were. And so the city fell in very hard times, and it was no longer a place that people wanted to come and visit. Instead, people avoided the place. But one day, a visitor came, a traveler, who came through town and just kind of looked around and noticed and heard all the people complaining and avoiding each other and treating each other badly. They felt so sad that this is what had become of this town that had once had this marvelous reputation of being one of the most welcoming places in the land. People treated the stranger with suspicion. And so the stranger decided that the only way to find out more information was to go and visit the mayor. So the stranger went and knocked on the mayor's door. And after some not so great interaction with some of the people at City Hall, was able to sit down and have a conversation with the mayor. The stranger said, "Oh, it's so sad to see how difficult things are in this town right now." And the mayor said, I have no idea how this happened. It happened before I became mayor. But it is a really sad thing. There's such beautiful people and such a beautiful place that we struggle so much to just get along. The stranger said, "Well, I think I have an answer to your problem. but you're going to need to be able to call all the townspeople together to be able to hear what I have to say. So the mayor did this. It was hard work, and a lot of people complained and were not happy about having to go to yet another meeting. But finally, most of the people in the town showed up in the town square, and the mayor introduced the stranger and introduced the stranger as being somebody who had that might help them find a better way to live. The stranger got up on the podium and said, "So I have traveled. I have traveled through many lands and seen many things. And one of the reasons that I came here to this town today was that I've heard a story. I've heard a story that somewhere in this town there lives a Messiah, a great teacher, a great leader of people, somebody who knows how to make the world and help us find ways to live and live into making the world a better place." The traveler said, "That's all my message is. I'm still looking for that person. Maybe you can help me." And with that, the stranger decided it was time to go. And a funny thing happened that day. At first, people were very skeptical and said, "Yeah, what a crazy message, right?" But slowly, one by one, people started thinking, could the Messiah be the person who's standing next to me? Could the Messiah be the person that I snapped at in the donut shop this morning? Could the Messiah be the cab driver who I gave some hassle to because I didn't like the way they were driving? Or maybe it was my kid or my partner or a loved one. And slowly, the city started to change. And people started treating each other with respect, because who wants to be mean or unkind to somebody who might be the Messiah? And even travelers who came to that city were welcomed with open arms and with great hospitality, because who knows, that person amongst them could be the Messiah. And thus ends our story.
This is tying in with the story we heard. It's a reading from the Bible, and it's in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob wrestles with God. Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them cross the river. But Jacob stayed apart by himself, and a man wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the man saw that he couldn't defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. The man said, "Let me go, because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." He said to Jacob, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel, because you struggled with God and with men and won." Jacob also asked and said, "Tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen God face to face, and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed through Peniel, limping because of his thigh. Therefore, Israelites don't eat the tendon attached to the thigh muscle to this day, because he grabbed Jacob's thigh muscle at its tendon.
I wanted the gold, I got it. I scrambled the muck like a slave. Was it famine or scurvy? I fought it. I hurled my youth into a grave. I wanted the gold, I got it. I came out with a fortune last fall. Yet somehow the gold is not what I thought it. And somehow that gold is not all. These prophetic words by the late Canadian poet Robert Service tell the story of an individual who, in search of fame and fortune, sets out to answer the call of the Yukon gold rush at the beginning of the 20th century. This individual leaves everything they have behind in their home in Eastern Canada and travels out into Yukon, the vast rugged wilderness of Western Canada, seeking their fame and fortune. Through many months of very difficult and arduous living, this individual finally finds gold in the wilderness, stakes a claim, and then goes and lives in the city and lives the lavish life with all the wonderful things that that newfound wealth could provide. But in this poem, The Spell of the Yukon, this individual starts yearning once again to go back out into the vast wilderness of the Yukon to see all that beautiful natural beauty that sings and makes their heart come alive, but also because there's something about that part of nature that accepts them. You see, living in the city and society with all their newfound wealth, they find that they are judged, and they judge themselves even more. Somehow they don't fit in. Sometimes there's a part of themselves that they don't quite fully accept, some part of themselves that they feel guarded about or might even consider to be a flaw. And so this individual once again yearns to go back out into the vast ruggedness of wilderness, because in wilderness accepts you just for who you are, every bit of you, not just part of you. When you think about it, this story is not all that dissimilar from the story that we heard a little snippet of in our reading earlier about Jacob. Now, for those of you who have not kept up on your Hebrew scriptures, the story of Jacob kind of goes a little bit like this. When we're first introduced to Jacob, we realize that he is not exactly an exemplary individual. He deceives his father into bestowing the family blessing on him, and in doing that, he cheats his brother out of his inheritance. Both his brother and his father are really angry with him, and so, fearing for his life, Jacob runs away to live in a far-off outpost with a cousin named Laban. As the wheels of justice turn, his cousin Laban does unto Jacob just as Jacob did unto his father and his brother. Laban cheats him several times, but still Jacob finally manages to prevail and to move on and to live a good life. But he is haunted by what he did to his brother and his father. He finally realizes that the only way that he is going to live a life of ease is to go back and confront them and try to make amends. So he packs up his huge family and his enormous amount of wealth and heads off across the desert to seek his brother and his father and ask their forgiveness. As he's crossing through the desert, they come to a place where a river runs through. He sends his family and his flocks and all his wealth across the river, but chooses to stay in the wilderness alone. We are told that in the night he is visited by an unknown being with whom he wrestles throughout the whole night. Now, some say that being was an angel. Some people say that being was God. Other people, like myself, we might say maybe what he was really wrestling with was his own conscience, his own self. He wrestles and wrestles and wrestles throughout the night, and neither one prevails. And as the dawn is breaking, the being says, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." The being says, "What is your name?" And Jacob says, "Jacob." And the being says, "No, your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with beings both human and divine, and you have prevailed. I like this story because it tells a truth, I believe, about our human condition. I believe that each and every one of us know no matter how much confidence we seem to exude, every one of us has some part of ourselves that we feel guarded about, some part of ourselves that we might not like, some part of ourselves that we wish other people didn't know about us, some part of ourselves that we might even consider a flaw. But it is my belief that if we take the time through the work of spiritual practice to be with those parts of ourselves, the gifts that we can find there are more precious than gold. One example of this story is a situation where I was working as an intern, as a hospital chaplain in my seminary training. I had been called down to the emergency room to deliver the message to a young 20-year-old mother that her father, who had been brought into the emergency department about an hour earlier, had been pronounced dead on arrival. As I sat with this, before I sat with this woman, I heard that there's this medical staff were really angry. They were angry with this man because he had apparently been experiencing chest pains for almost 2 weeks before the incident, but refused to seek medical help. And they were really angry because they're used to saving lives, and they felt like this individual hadn't given them a chance to do so. When I sat down with the daughter, I heard a very different story. She said, "You see, my dad was a heroin addict. He knew that if he went into the hospital to seek medical treatment, the first thing they would do would be to draw blood. And if they found heroin in his blood, that would have been a violation of his parole, and they would have sent him right back to prison. He actually had been joking the week or two before that he'd rather die of a heart attack than go back to jail." I stayed with this woman and her young family until they were ready to go. And I did something that I found I did a lot of those days, as I went up into the chapel and I sat down and tried to reflect on what I had just experienced. In doing so, I felt a call, a need to go back down to the emergency department to bless the body of this poor, unfortunate man. As I walked in the door, I was grabbed by the social worker who said, "Drew, oh, we're just getting ready to page you. We're glad you're back." And they proceeded to introduce me to the partner, the lover of the deceased. I remember sitting in this tiny little room with her beloved laid out on a gurney. And for 10 solid minutes, she sobbed and wailed uncontrollably. Finally, she turned to me and she looked me right in the eye and said, "But you don't understand. This man is the most beautiful man that I have ever known. This is the only man who ever treated me with respect. This is the only man who ever truly loved me. Yes, it is true that he had an addiction to heroin, but what's really funny is he forbade me or anybody else around him to ever get near this stuff." She said he worked in the apartment that he lived in to make sure that when kids came home from school, they had a safe apartment to go to where they could do their homework and have some support and do fun and games instead of being outside and falling victim to the people who were selling drugs around the neighborhood. She said at one point they even had somebody was trying to sell drugs right at the front door of their apartment building, and he actually had the strength to go down and talk to that person and tell them not to come back. And they didn't. This individual had a flaw, or something we might consider as a flaw, an addiction. And yet somehow he was able to take that flaw or that thing that he felt very uncomfortable about himself and use it as a gift to serve others. Unfortunately, it was a gift that he was not able to give himself. Now, sometimes in the course of our lives, we are very aware of the things that we feel guarded against, those parts of ourselves that we feel uncomfortable with, those parts of ourselves that we may even judge as being a flaw. And sometimes we're not. That experience came to me while I was in my seminary training about 14 years or so ago, a little bit longer. And I was just finishing up a mini internship in my home congregation in Manchester, Connecticut. And I had been working with a committee of people for over 2 years who were reviewing my work. And they said to me, Drew, what are you going to do when you finish this program? And we're not around to help look at your papers and proofread some of your communications and things like that. Because we've noticed that they need those kinds of help if you're going to be a professional. And I said, well, I hadn't really thought about it all that much. And at our very last meeting, 2 of the members of that committee pulled me aside and said, Drew, this is kind of awkward. We're not quite sure how to say this, but have you ever thought about getting tested to see if you have any learning differences? Well, I said, well, I know my brother has got several significant learning differences, and my mom went back to school to become a special ed teacher because of that. But no, I mean, I'm in grad school, and I seem to be doing all right. Yeah, I know my spelling is a little off and such, but I said, well, maybe you should try looking into it. Just a suggestion, just do with it what you will. So these are people I trusted. And so I went back and I decided to get some testing done. I remember sitting in the room with the fellow who did the assessments on my learning styles. And he kind of sat down at the desk and he looked at me at the end of the day after all these tests had been administered. And he said, so Drew, you're in graduate school, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, how's that going for you? And I had to admit to him that it was a struggle. It was hard to keep up with the really large reading lists and the amount of writing and papers that we had to do. And it's something that ate into all of my free time. I didn't have a lot of time except to study and to work. He said, well, I think we figured out what's going on. You have a condition called dyslexia. And on a scale from 1 to 10, you're probably around about a 7. That means that it takes you about 3 times as long to read things. It means that your ability to proofread things and write can be a little challenging at times. And so he said, so at least we've got this understanding now of what's going on. And then he provided me with this big, huge, thick folder full of brochures of all kinds of new technologies and trainings and things like that I could do to try to mitigate the effects of my learning difference. So I did what most of you other folks might consider doing when you look at something like that. I realized I could probably quit my day job and stop going to school and spend the rest of my life going through this big, huge pile of things. So I just picked the top 2 or 3 things and started working them. And I worked really hard. I put forth as much effort as I could. I spent all my free time working on developing these new skills and trying to use these new pieces of technology that would help me get better and go through overcome my dyslexia. And I worked and I worked and I worked for almost 2 years without having much of a social life, without doing much of anything else but school, working on my dyslexia and working. And guess what? After 2 years of doing this stuff, guess what? Yeah, I still had dyslexia. It didn't go away. I learned some things, but it was still there. So my moment of salvation came when I was working in my final internship for my seminary degree. And I was sitting in the parking lot of the church that I was serving, and on the radio, there came this interview on a program called Fresh Air, which is part of the National Public Radio system in the States. The interviewer was interviewing this husband and wife team who had been working for about 20 years with people who had dyslexia. And well, there were certain things that made processing language and writing and reading and all those kinds of things harder for people with dyslexia. What they discovered is that people with dyslexia also had all kinds of major gifts that a lot of people in the rest of the world wish they could have. But there was a really high propensity for people to have these gifts that were kind of coping mechanisms, of creative ways that people had learned to work with their learning difference. I sat there kind of mesmerized by this. And the title of the book is The Dyslexic Advantage. And all of a sudden, my mind started to shift. How could this thing that had been so difficult for me throughout my whole life, being undiagnosed as with learning differences, going through school and university, how could this be an advantage? And the book really opened my mind to different ways that I could be able to engage the work that I was about to set out in doing. This sermon, for instance, is one of those examples because I am not reading or looking at notes. What I found is that I still struggle sometimes with my dyslexicness. I have found that there are ways that I can use it in very skillful and wonderful ways. And I also find that sometimes there are parts of it that make life very difficult. But as I've learned to accept that part of myself, I find that my anxiety, my energy continues to rise. And that although there is still some deep wounding that has happened to me over the years because of it, I am able to continue on and to not let things choke me up or set me back, but I continue to grow and to move through. It's by accepting that part of myself that I, at one point, may have considered to be a flaw. And when I first came up with this idea for this sermon, I was saying that I don't know that I fully accept or love that part of myself, and I can say today that I do. Again, I think that this message, this story, and these stories provide a great example for all of us, because I think all of us struggle with something. It's just part of what it means to be human. But if we take the time to go deep inside with spiritual practice and accepting help from other people who have skills that can help us understand some of those things in a very different light, then we can continue to grow and learn. And often when we embrace those difficult parts of ourselves, what we find is more precious than gold. If we do that work, if we make that commitment, we might still carry some of the wounding and the damage that came from not accepting that part of ourselves for a long time. But the end, what we find is that we grow. And it is then, and only then, if we do that hard work, that we too can change our names to Israel, because we will have struggled with beings, both divine and human, and our lives will have been spared and have grown, and will have been grown interconnectedly in a way that creates passion, compassion, and love. Blessed be, and amen.